Welcome to the Filmlings podcast,
an edited in-camera podcast where we analyze all that goes into effective filmmaking.
I'm Jonathan.
And I'm Alex.
And this is episode 149, John Ford's Golden Era.
That's right. It's the second part of our Western series. We've left the silent world behind, but we're going to piggyback off of the last film from that episode to jump right into the career of John Ford.
Yeah, we're coming straight from the John Ford film that we finished last time, The Iron Horse, and then we're getting into the stuff that made him one of the legends of early cinema. And this is really going to be kind of the bedrock of the rest of the series of Westerns, because John Ford is indispensable in the rest of the history of Westerns. And he made some big movies, and he was a big personality. So Alex, why don't you tell us how John Ford got to be the director that we know him as now?
Well, John Ford was born John Martin Feeney, or if you ask him in the Irish, Sean Aloysius O'Feeney, in Cape Elizabeth, Maine in 1894 to Irish immigrants. He followed his brother Francis to California in 1914 to work in the film industry, adopting the anglicized name of Ford for his career, one that his brothers would as well. Francis Ford?
No way.
Yeah, right. I just noticed that. Francis Ford Coppola. I don't
the Hollywood
think there's a
references.
connection.
I mean,
but yeah.
It's a Hollywood dynasty.
I don't think they're related though.
Well, not related, but it can't not be a reference, at least.
It could be, that's for sure. Anyway, Francis Ford had started his career in vaudeville before becoming a successful film actor in the early silent era, performing in films for the likes of the Edison Company and Georges Méliès, both of which we talked about during our silent era episode. As you can see, these are all going to build off of each other. Everything is connected in one big, huge Western tapestry. He joined the Hollywood exodus to the West Coast and became an actor, writer, director with his own production unit at Universal Studios, which gave him quite a bit of leverage. In fact, enough leverage to bring his brother, John Ford, over to work as his assistant stuntman, stand-in, actor, and cameraman on many silent films, which...
Nepotism.
One, nepotism, but two, one of the best forms of film education you could possibly get, which is actually working on films in a lot of different roles. That's one of the things that you'll see a lot, is that the people typically with the most developed successful film careers are quite frequently, although not always, the people who kind of have the most diverse background in working in various roles in the storytelling. So the best directors are the people who understand lighting and acting and stunts and set design and all of that as well. So if you want to get good at everything, you got to practice everything too. Directing isn't really a role in and of itself. It's knowing everything, or at least a little bit of everything. Anyway, digression aside, his first shot as a director in his own right came in the 1917 silent film Tornado. Although, because no one really tracked things back then, because nobody really cared, and there wasn't a Wikipedia, there's some dispute as to what his actual first directorial debut was, with some claiming that the later was Lucille the Waitress from 1914. Ford claimed that he got his job when Carl Laemmle, the very famous head of Universal, said, "Give Jack Ford the job. He yells good." Which seems to be about the extent of decision-making back in the day, but still one
that also seems to have summed up his whole career going forward.
Yeah, pretty much. But also a course of decision-making that seems to be going better than Netflix's course of decision-making. Haha, you thought we were going to get through an episode without me taking a shot at streaming giants. You were wrong.
Never.
One of the busiest directors ever, like literally ever. He has made so many movies. Having started in the silent era, but only 10 of his 60 silent films have survived through to today. We watched one of them previously, The Iron Horse. His first full-length feature, Straight Shooting, in 1917, was intended as a two-reeler, but Ford and his friend/actor Harry Carey Sr., who starred in many of his movies, even into the sound era, overshot it and just kind of forced it through to become his first feature. His first major success was covered on our last episode, The Iron Horse, and this had a cast and crew numbering well into the thousands, was shot off of a synopsis on location, being written and shot day by day, which is something I did not realize when we discussed the movie last episode, but that is truly crazy. One,
especially for a film that's
expensive.
A film that starts itself as every detail of this film is factually accurate, even though we made it up on the fly every single day.
Yeah, that explains a lot about how that film got to be the way it was. But also, it shows quite the impressive bit of organizational skill on John Ford's part, something for which he would actually become rather famous. Ford shot the first on-screen song of the sound era for Fox in Mother McCree from 1928, and this was also the first Ford film to feature John Wayne as an uncredited extra, and those two famously paired together in their Hollywood careers. Around this time, F.W. Murnau also joined Fox to shoot Sunrise, A Song of Two Humans, which had a notable influence on Ford's work, and especially in some of his later works that were intentionally shot in black and white, even though they were well into the color era, and we'll discuss those later in this episode. But through the classical era of Hollywood, Ford cranked out 2 to 3 films a year, which is really fast for that period, and worked with a huge array of actors, including Victor McLaglen, Myrna Lloyd, John Wayne, Harry Carey Sr. and Jr., Humphrey Bogart, and Spencer Tracy, to name just a few. And he even shot the last two's acting debut in Up the River from 1930. He became renowned as a director who could shoot incredibly efficiently, effectively, and artfully, making films that garnered both box office success and critical acclaim, coming in both under time and under budget, which made him a big favorite with a lot of studios, if you could do that, and then, win awards and make a lot of money at the box office. That's the trifecta right there. Between 1926 and 1939, Ford actually didn't make a Western. The genre was out of favor in the early sound era, but that changed with Stagecoach from 1939, one of the most successful Western films ever, and one that Orson Welles claimed to have watched upwards of 40 times in preparation for Citizen Kane. Stagecoach was nominated for 7 Academy Awards and launched the success of John Wayne's career as well, and has been previously featured on the Filmlings. It's in one of our earlier episodes too, I think.
Yeah, I think that was our Western overview episode.
Yeah. This launched the period of Ford's career during which he made his super classic Western films, the ones we all know, and the ones that, and he also made a lot of other super classic films that weren't Westerns, but were very clearly inspired by Westerns, such as The Grapes of Wrath from 1940 and How Green Was My Valley from 1941, which famously beat out Citizen Kane for the Academy Award that year at the Oscars. He served as the head. How mad can
you be if your film gets beat out by your hero? Like,
yeah, right. Like that's definitely an aspect that we didn't. I don't think we really discussed when we talked about that. On the Orson Welles episode. But Orson Welles definitely really loved John Ford, and I don't think he personally would have been upset to have lost to John Ford. The conflict was more of Welles versus the Academy itself.
Right.
But Ford served as the head of the photographic unit for the OSS, which is the precursor to the CIA, during World War II, making documentaries such as the Battle of Midway from 1942, during the shooting of which he was actually shot in the arm by machine gun fire. During the 40s and 50s, Ford continued his Western successes, but at a much reduced rate compared to the silent era and early sound era, and increasingly ventured into other genres. He started his own company called Argosy Pictures and completed his Calvary trilogy, which is the trilogy that you'll probably see most replayed on old daytime television networks, along with El Dorado. I see these three in El Dorado on TV all the time at the gym. I don't know why, but they're there. Fort Apache, She Wore Yellow Ribbon, and Rio Grande comprise the Calvary trilogy. The Searchers would be the only Western Ford made during the 50s, which if you had to make only one Western. Yeah, I mean, it's pretty dominant. in that category. He would return to active duty during the Korean War to make another documentary called Korea Battleground for Liberty from 1959. By the 60s, decades of drinking, smoking, battling, and philandering had caught up with Ford. His eyesight began, as they do. His eyesight began to falter, and he began to rely more on assistance, which I mentioned mostly because it echoes the later course of the career of one of his biggest fans, Akira Kurosawa. He had also finally been pigeonholed by this time as a Western director, and that was really the only genre for which he could garner secure funding. The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance from 1962 was frequently cited as the last great film of his career, and I mentioned again that he shot some black and white movies at a time when color movies were already the main form of film, and that's a good example. But we'll be talking about that more in detail later. His last narrative feature was Seven Women from 1966, and his last documentary was Chesty, A Tribute to a Legend, which was released posthumously. I believe that is a reference to a military figure, by the way, nicknamed Chesty, which is an interesting thing to be named. I'm sure the documentary explains it. He passed in 1973 in Palm Desert, California. But, Jonathan, we do have to select only a few films from John Ford's truly prodigious oeuvre. So which three are we going to be talking about today?
Indeed. So we're starting off with My Darling Clementine from 1946, directed by John Ford, written by Samuel Ingle and Winston Miller, based on the story of Wyatt Earp, starring Henry Fonda, Victor Mature, Linda Darnell, and Walter Brennan, cinematography by Joseph McDonald, and edited by Dorothy Spencer. Then we'll be following that with The Searchers from 1956, also directed by John Ford, screenplay by Frank S. Nugent, based on The Searchers by Alan LeMay, starring John Wayne, Jeffrey Hunter, Vera Miles, Ward Bond, and Natalie Wood, with cinematography by Winston C. Hawk, edited by Jack Murray. And finally, we'll be talking about The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, directed by John Ford, written by James Warner Bella and Willis Goldbeck, based on The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance by Dorothy M. Johnson, starring, for the first time, John Wayne and Jimmy Stewart. Also Lee Marvin, Vera Miles, and Woody Strode. Cinematography by William H. Clothier, edited by Otto Lovering.
All right, without further ado, Jason, take it away from My Darling Clementine.
My Darling Clementine from 1946. Wyatt Earp and his brothers are driving cattle to California when their youngest brother is shot dead outside of Tombstone, Arizona. The remaining brothers become the marshals in the lawless town in their search for the culprits behind the cowardly killing. Along the way, they make frenemies with the consumption-ridden Doc Holliday, who's run away from his fiancée, Clementine, to the west. It all leads to the famous showdown at the OK Corral.
So the most interesting thing about My Darling Clementine, at least from the pre-moving watching perspective, is that if you read the name My Darling Clementine, you still have no idea what the movie's about.
Right.
No clue. It's not really about Clementine. Clementine's like in there, and she kind of provides like a dramatic anchor, but it's not really about that.
It's just a way to put... Well, actually, they put a female on the cover, but it's not even Clementine on the cover. Yeah. Which is funny.
Yeah. I mean, it's based on the book, but really this is both based on one of the most famous Western stories that everybody's heard about, even if you don't realize it's a story, the shootout at the OK Corral.
Loosely based,
yeah. And because the actual story of the OK Corral is even dodgier than like the story portrayed in My Darling Clementine.
Yeah.
Which is interesting because, and we're going to see this today. We talked about last time how in the silent era, how the Western is kind of like an exercise in mythologizing a period of history. And this is kind of a love letter to that idea. It's everything
the whole
is kind
of John Ford's career ends up kind of struggling with that, which I think is what we're going to come back around to in a big way with The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance. But we're kind of starting in full-on mythology territory with My Darling Clementine.
Yeah. very, very for sure. Everything is ennobled. Like the actions are much more noble.
Even the way the characters
dramatized.
talk and interact with each other.
It is what people accused classic Hollywood of often being, which is a measure of unreality, which is true, but also all Hollywood, all movie making is a measure of unreality.
Storytelling. Yeah. I mean,
storytelling. Yeah.
It's not necessarily, I mean, depending on how you go about it, like putting every part of this movie is true, like kind of dampens the effect. But the point is, what is the story trying to say beyond the facts that it's portraying? Yeah.
The most interesting, and we talked about the act of mythologizing being kind of core to the Western. And I think what you're seeing here is the most famous story of the Western going through that process and created by the director who is most associated with the Western, John Ford, right? So it's
although
the master
he wasn't
of the
at
Western.
the time necessarily. He was starting to be, but this is still early.
Yeah. He had kind of brought the genre back with the Stagecoach, and then it kind of took off on its own. But it probably wouldn't be until like The Searchers and later efforts that he really became known as the Western guy, especially by that time. And speaking of things that are an act in mythologizing, the Academy Awards had really stepped in to kind of do stuff like Lifetime Achievement Awards and kind of fulfill their destiny of basically being the organization that tells the story of Hollywood to the public.
Right.
I don't want to use the term propaganda because I think that has a negative connotation, but there is an element of the Academy's existence, even from its start in the early 30s, to avoid trust busting, that is there to portray the industry, Hollywood, in a certain light so that the public regards it in a certain light. And one of the things they did, especially in the 60s, was give out Lifetime Achievement Awards. We saw this with Fred Astaire. But it happened with Henry Ford as well. And during that period is kind of when people get known for stuff and people start playing movies on repeat on TV. And John Ford kind of became known as the Western guy.
Yeah, but actually, speaking of, I believe the American Film Institute gave John Ford their first Lifetime Achievement Award. But yeah, there's a mythology of Hollywood happening at the same time that Hollywood is being known for mythologizing.
Yeah. John Ford's career was ending at the time that Cahiers du Cinema, the French New Wave, and the American New Wave were taking off, and they were big fans of classic directors like this, so it kind of makes sense. But folks like John Ford were a big fan of Western storytelling of their own and even worked hand in hand, especially in their early career with folks like Wyatt Earp, who we talked about last time, became a consultant in Hollywood for Western movies.
Yeah.
So it only makes sense that his story would end up on the big screen. And to kind of clarify what we've been talking about with mythologizing, we can't go over the whole story of the Earps because the whole story of the Earps involves a lot of riding from town to town and getting into trouble. A very Western story in a lot of ways, much less noble than it's made out to be in this movie. But for starters, every Earp brother lived to a ripe old age, and the one who we see die in the start of the film was the only Earp brother to not become a kind of lawman / semi-outlaw in the West. He just stayed a shopkeep for all of his days and was A-okay. And even though it's hinted at, to clarify, Doc Holliday was very sick with tuberculosis, which after looking into it is a shockingly deadly disease that still kills a lot of people, even though we have medicine to cure it. It is one of the biggest killers of humanity ever. So tuberculosis, watch out for that consumption. Doc Holliday ended up dying at the age of 30, not too long after the events portrayed in this movie. And to be further, to clarify and demystify even more, the Earp brothers worked with the Claytons, who are the bad cowboys you see in this movie, and people like them just as much as they worked against them. Often
the Clantons, or
I read it as the Claytons in the story with on the Wyatt Earp page. It might have been changed in the movie.
Yeah, Clanton in the movie. It's Clanton.
Well, there you go. The they would work with them just as much as they would work against them. Another fun fact, because again, while this is all mythologized, these people did live pretty crazy lives. There just wasn't, to be clear, when we're talking about mythologizing, we're talking about the act of applying some kind of order to what is typically the disorderly existence of a person's life. Yeah. So when you're telling a story, obviously you need stuff like themes and motivations and clear through lines to tell a good story. And so they're applied here. When in actuality, most people's lives maybe don't have that clear of a through line and don't have that consistent of themes, and decisions are just kind of made as situations come up. But in here, they're kind of all stitched together in a single kind of episodic tale that is of the Noble West, of some brothers who who didn't want to stomach the slight of a brother who was killed in a cowardly manner. Yeah. Even notice that they made sure to clarify that their brother wasn't just killed, he was shot in the back. Yeah. To be clear, that was calling them out for cowardice, which is almost an even greater slight in this mythologized version of the West than
they
being a murderer.
They killed two of them by shooting them in the back.
Yeah. And they do that, and then all of the cowboys who died are shot in the front, I believe.
Yeah, I think so. So yeah, and one other thing about this, in terms of kind of crafting history into mythology, is in looking at our great resource, Wikipedia, the gunfight at the OK Corral page. It turns out that actually Virgil Earp was the marshal in Tombstone. But I think because Wyatt Earp became more famous later and became part of, like we were already talking about, he became a consultant to Hollywood. He became part of the person who created the mythology. He gets put at the front of this story in particular.
Oh, yeah. That makes a lot of sense. And I think
that's actually going to play a part, because I almost wonder if there's a nod to that in The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance. The fact that even though Wyatt Earp wasn't the head of this thing in the actual events, he gets kind of made into this big hero because of kind of the way that he presented himself after the fact. Not to say that he was necessarily being misleading, or, I mean, there's still kind of an honoring of the things that he did in the Old West through stories like this. But it's still kind of, elevating him to a level that he wasn't in the actual events. And that's, again, just part of making a mythology. It's all about how you portray the event after the fact rather than how they actually happen. And that's a lot of what The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance is all about.
Oh yeah. 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 And we should talk about how kind of like this connects back even further to the silent era as well. Not only in terms of locations and how they're shot, which obviously John Ford himself had a part in, being one of the early silent film Western shooters who crafted shots like those we see in The Iron Horse, but also in terms of acting types. We covered William S. Hart in the previous episode, the kind of strong silent type. And we mentioned actually that he would kind of evolve into the Henry Ford type later on, in terms of Western tropes. And we see that here. Henry Ford kind of has that silent... Henry Fonda, sorry.
It's all... Henry Ford is a different type.
Henry Ford is the car guy. Yeah. But yeah, he would evolve into Henry Fonda, who kind of has the same air about him, where he is very quiet and reserved most of the time until he's ready to actually strike, and then he's incredibly violent. Yeah. And these kind of it works really well for this tension buildup, because you just kind of see Henry Fonda just kind of exudes his charisma silently throughout the whole piece by either playing poker or taking a drink at the bar or waiting by the stagecoach station.
Oh no, he does play poker. He has to call out the cheaters at the poker game.
Yeah.
Because this is something that is definitely sort of a Western trope. It's the morally upright, staunch hero walks into the decrepit town, the hive of evil and villainy, and he literally says 4 or 5 times, "What kind of a town is this?" And he's throwing people around, and then they just elect him marshal because no one else has the guts to actually stand up to anyone. And that's a big part of what this film is and what Westerns sort of become a lot of times, especially the marshal versus outlaw type stories.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. There's something reminiscent of like kind of the storyline you'd see in something like High Noon. To a certain extent. But even that is an act of mythology in terms of like how, supposedly. So even setting apart like whatever factually happened in the Old West, like just the idea that one person could walk into a town full of people who are outlaws and shooting guns in the street and can straighten them all up is absolutely absurd.
That's 310 to Yuma too, right? We covered that, and that's not a marshal, but it's still the one guy who's willing to do what's right, even though it's super dangerous.
Yeah, and the one guy who's willing to do what's right is, I think, a pretty key cornerstone of the Western mythology as well. You see it in a lot of heroic tropes and stuff like fantasy as well. But there's something about the Western that I think kind of merges the ideas of fantasy with the American idea of like rugged individualism that often shows or tells a story through the lens of one person being the one person who's morally upright and everybody else is wrong or bad or evil or a bystander, and that one person is going to set everything straight, which is 99% of the time not how anything works. But
it's even not even how it works in this film, because we have Wyatt Earp being kind of spotlighted, but he even has his 2 or 3 brothers that are there with him the whole time. And every time he gets into a scrap, they're right behind him. Which is great.
It often plays out.
But they don't build up that sense of community that he has. Although by the end, you do have the Earp family versus the Clanton family.
Yes.
But a lot of times it just feels like this is Wyatt Earp. Although I will also say, it as much as it felt like Wyatt Earp's story, it also feels like Doc Holliday's story. But it feels like Doc Holliday's story from a distance. There's almost more development of Doc Holliday, but not from his point of view. We're discovering and learning about him throughout the story, which is really interesting.
Yeah.
He's
Doc
got
is
a lot of that anti-hero stuff going on.
Yeah, he's set up as a foil, I think, to Wyatt Earp, even more than the Clantons, who kind of take a rather
they're just straight
antagonists.
Seat. Yeah, like everything they do is just against Wyatt Earp.
Yeah, in a lot of ways, they kind of function as a secret boss because they're not in most of the movie.
Yeah, right.
And then they just kind of like they get into a scrap at the end that leads to everybody figuring out what they actually did at the beginning of the movie, and then we get to the OK Corral. It's almost like we have a big intermission in the middle while we wait to get to the OK Corral, during which we have the story of the for lack of a better term, kind of like the White Knight style hero of Wyatt Earp versus the anti-hero style of Doc Holliday and the pair of women who are kind of caught between them as well. Show up along the way, which is, again, like good thematic storytelling in terms of creating those foils to create themes and messages of heroicism and what would be the heroic option for Holiday? Would it be to stay with the woman he loves, even though she would have to watch him die a horrible, painful death from consumption, or would it be to go out here in the West away from her so she can live a life on her own? And then what happens when she shows up against his will too in the town? And even then, like, we even get back into, and we talked about how like even medieval chivalric storytelling influenced the Western, and we get into kind of this idea of chivalry and like how you should treat a woman, and the actions of Wyatt Earp towards Clementine while she's in the town. Oh
yeah, he's the model of gentlemanry, which that element of, gentlemanry or chivalry is also something that's kind of consistent throughout Ford's career. We even saw it it plays a big role in Stagecoach, which was based on the Guy de Maupassant story, Ball of Fat. But the whole thing is about the stagecoach of people, and they find out that one of the ladies on the stagecoach is a prostitute, and John Wayne's character is the only one who will still respect her. And so there's a lot of that, and there's going to be even more of that in The Searchers in a second. But that's part of this tableau of a certain type of masculinity that is being portrayed from a lot of different angles throughout Ford's career.
Oh yeah, that's a good point, because a big huge piece of Ford's work and his whole canon is wrestling with the idea of masculinity, and he has like a bajillion different takes on it. And oftentimes you'll see tropes like the guy who doesn't act outwardly, or like even separating the ideas, I should say, of manliness and heroism. Sometimes they're entwined, and sometimes the man who doesn't act the most manly is the man who's the most heroic in the story, or vice versa.
Right.
And he plays with that a lot. It's a huge theme in his work.
Yeah, definitely.
We should mention though, before I do want to talk about the cinematography in this movie and kind of how it other ways in which it is a love letter to Westerns in general. But you did mention how Earp kind of goes around with his gang of brothers, and it ends up being kind of his gang of brothers in Holiday versus the gang of the Clantons and their friends. And part of that,
well, I think it was literally all his sons.
All his sons, yeah. It was a big family feud. But part of that feels very, very, very Yojimbo to me. And that is, I think, intentional. That's very direct. That is intentional. Kurosawa was a kid when John Ford was in the prime of his career. And Kurosawa basically grew up on John Ford's work in a large part, and it influenced his work in a huge way. And we'll talk about some more of their interactions later on, but that, and hint, wink, wink. There's a reason we're following the thread of influence through history from John Ford to Japan in an upcoming episode.
Oh yeah.
But yeah, what do you think of the cinematography in this film, Jonathan?
So here's a quote from the Convos of the AFI book, which I dusted off. We haven't referenced this in a while, but it's one of our kind of go-tos for classic Hollywood info. And there's an interview with William Clothier, who, as we mentioned, shot The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance. But he's just kind of talking about John Ford and his techniques and stuff like that. And it's told that John Ford wouldn't let a water wagon on the set, which would basically be if you're out filming in the desert and it gets too dusty, you kind of hose it all down so that the dust all stays. And John Ford hated that. And
I see where this is going.
Clothier says, the old man said, 2 things make Western pictures, horse manure and dust. And I remember this one time when I was an operator, some cameraman got a water wagon and Ford blew his top. He was going to fire the guy. The guy said, we'll have dust. And Ford said, hell, that's why I came out here. I want the dust. And dust, especially in backlight, is terrific. It adds to the drama. I rarely use a water wagon. I had actors scream because they got their eyes full of dust, including John Wayne. He'll say, I can't see it in the dust. And I said, well, the script said they want dust and wind, so we've got wind machines and we've got dust. Close your eyes or get a double. So there's this...
The Western squint exists for a reason.
The Western squint, yeah. I could just see Clint Eastwood like just always having that. But when we're talking about the cinematography, we're talking about Westerns, and we're getting into things like Yojimbo. Dust is so important. And Clothier goes on to talk about how, people are afraid that dust is going to ruin their cameras and stuff like that. And he's like, I've never had so much dust that I couldn't use my camera. You can get a pretty good layer of dust on the camera and still shoot through it. And actually, it adds a good effect. It like softens the whole thing.
I was about to say, it should work as like an Atmo fog machine.
Yeah.
Right? It should like kind of diffuse the light to kind of create a glow.
Yeah.
A nice
but
backlight.
when we're talking about the cinematography, like I'm thinking when we get to the climax, the gunfight at the OK Corral, which, by the way, in real life lasted about 30 seconds. I think in this movie it takes like 3 minutes.
Just like D&D combat.
Right. Anyway, but you've got Wyatt Earp coming out slowly with his brothers behind him and the Clantons just standing there, but they're coming out straight towards the camera. Dust is blowing, and it's almost that famous shot from Yojimbo where Yojimbo's standing there. Dust is blowing behind him. He's almost silhouetted because there's so much light coming through the dust. And so this is the kind of atmosphere that you get. This is the kind of film that starts setting an atmosphere for what all Westerns are going to be going forward.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. And it kicks off like that. And we talked about this so much in the silent era. And I did that on purpose. Where we were talking about how like British versions of the Westerns influenced American versions of the Westerns that influenced French versions or what have you. It all became a loop. And this is another good example of it. And like, yeah, find that dust. It's an excellent technique. And then it just becomes a signature because John Ford's so prolific and everyone's influenced by John Ford. So now it's everywhere. And I love it. It's great. I mean, we'll see it when we talk about like spaghetti Westerns too. Like there's just so much dust everywhere, but it's central to like the mythology of the Western. Like you picture a Western shootout, it's a lone figure walking down a dusty street. He's squinting and he's about to go shoot out with some bad guys.
We don't quite have tumbleweeds yet, but that's part of the picture here.
Oh man, I still remember the first time I actually saw a tumbleweed on the road. Like I was driving on the highway in Arizona and an actual tumbleweeds.
That's what it is. It just
gigantic. Just fly across the road. And it's actually a little terrifying because you don't realize how big some of those things can get. They're like the size of the car. But yeah. It all becomes part of it. And it's really fun. And that's one of the reasons why we picked My Darling Clementine, because it kind of feels like out of a lot of John Ford's work from this era, where he's really forging his idea of the Western, which would become central to the larger idea of the Western because of how big he was in the film space. It feels like the pinnacle of the idea of the mythology of the Western. It's such a love letter to the Western. There's so many parts of it, like the stagecoach station, the shootout, the saloons, the bar fights,
when we talked about Westerns that didn't look like Westerns in the last episode, this Western looks like a Western.
Yeah, this is we had to include a movie like this in this series because we wanted the most Western we could find. This is like based on one of the biggest stories out of the West. It has a lot of mythologizing in it. It has all of the Western themes that we like to talk about, minus a few here and there. And it is like, again, it's just the most Western I could think of.
Yeah. Last thing to mention on this, and I realized this in this film and the next one, and not quite so much in The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, but Ford was Pixaring himself. Did you notice this? He has references to his previous films in his films.
That kind of makes sense, actually. So, I can't think of an example, but it feels accurate.
The one I found in My Darling Clementine is when the Earps come into town, the first thing they do is they're looking for a haircut, and they go to the dentist/barber, which there was a dentist/barber in The Iron Horse, and the Three Stooges like characters were like trying to get the one guy with the toothache into the chair. And so then they do the same thing here, and the dentist barber plays this big part, and they're trying to give him a haircut in the dentist chair that keeps shifting on them, and he comes out cut more often than not. But I just thought that was a nice little nod, and I actually can't decide if there might be a nod to that in Django Unchained with Christoph Waltz's dentist wagon.
Well, I was about to say it is interesting because it is hard to say how much of it is John Ford Pixaring himself and how much of it is just that he created so many classic Westerns. And so his knowledge of Western tropes kind of became like a Pixar mythology.
Or it's just a thing he read one time and he just keeps trying to squeeze it in where he can.
Yeah, because I mean, it was a thing that your barber would also be your dentist at a certain point in history. And by dentistry, we're not talking about like modern dentists where like they actually clean your teeth and like perform cavity fillings and stuff. We talk about like you go in there if you have a toothache and the guy just pulls your tooth and that's it.
Someone with the guts to yank your teeth out.
There's a lot of great scenes with dentist barbers in John Ford films. There's a couple good ones with John Wayne, I think, and some of the cavalry movies. There's a few good ones in a lot of spaghetti westerns with Clint Eastwood, both when he was making them on his own in America and when he actually worked in Italy with dentist scenes. And then again, I was going to mention, I was thinking about it as you're talking about the Three Stooges, that the big wiggly tooth on the wagon in Django Unchained is probably a reference to this as well. And then, of course, I did notice that the stagecoach station itself, which might be the sheriff's office, I wasn't entirely sure, where the stagecoach keeps pulling up and people drop in and drop out. Those scenes often reminded me of the kind of the stagecoach setup at the start of Hateful Eight, but obviously snowy instead of dusty.
And just of course, by virtue of what it is, there's also some stagecoach element to that.
Yeah. And of course, Ford worked as many tropes as he could into this movie. There's the stagecoach, a stagecoach robbery. There's stagecoach chases. There's lots of stuff.
Yeah.
It's all packed in here.
The other thing that I noticed is in My Darling Clementine, the guy who's not really the preacher, but the guy who comes along and says, hey, we're building the church. The church is getting inaugurated or whatever. And that guy just keeps saying, Dad, blast it. We're going to have a dance. And he just keeps saying, Dad, blast it. And then as we transition into the Searchers, the marshal / preacher reverend in the Searchers says, Dad, blast it several times. So I thought that might be a little cheeky nod as well.
Well, I didn't check, but is there a possibility they're the same actor?
I don't think they were. The
guy in the Searchers was a much bigger actor.
Yeah,
I don't remember his name, but yeah.
And he was just a bigger guy. The guy in My Darling Clementine was kind of a scrawny old man.
Yeah, that makes sense. But yeah, no, I mean, that honestly makes sense. Also, I will say, if I were an actor in a John Ford movie, John Ford famously almost never gave actors direction. He would just yell at them if they didn't do what he wanted. Maybe not the best actor's director, but if I were working for him, I would go watch old John Ford movies. So maybe
work some of those in yourself, right?
Yeah, and of course he also had the rotating cast of oh man, I forgot what they called it. They had a really good name for it, a rotating actors company or something.
In the AFI book, Frank Capra actually talks about that. He says that Capra and Ford both had this mutual agreement to keep a certain set of pet actors in business. So they had a certain number that if Ford wasn't using them, Capra would use them, and they would kind of cycle through just to keep them working.
Yeah. That nepotism again, in a way, gotta keep your friends in business. Yep. But also it makes for a remarkable amount of consistency. And in the high stress, high paced working environment of a film set, it does make sense to find people who you like working with and then just keep working with them.
Yeah, I think Capra mentioned in that same section, it provides reliability. Like, if I've got this guy, and this guy, we're going to make a picture and it's going to be easy. Like, I don't have to stress about having to teach someone the way I work and all that kind of stuff. I know we got this. We just got to get a script in front of them.
Yeah, exactly. It is... once you don't have to go through that same beginning phase again of teaching people how to work together, learning how each other work. It's already a functional machine.
Yeah.
You just go with it. So yeah, you see that a lot. And we've talked about that before with auteur directors of the modern age, how they almost always have the same actors in their movies and how that just makes a lot of sense past a certain point. They just have the same people who work with you all the time.
Yep.
But yeah, let's slide into a slightly different take on the mythology of the West with The Searchers from 1956. Jason, take it away.
The Searchers from 1956. Ethan Edwards returns home to his brother's farmstead in West Texas after years away fighting for the Confederacy and the French in Mexico. He's glad to see his family again, save for his adopted nephew, Martin, who's 1/8 Native American. When a raid by a group of Comanche destroys the farm and obliterates most of the family, Ethan and Martin set out for an epic years-long quest across the American West to find Debbie, who's been kidnapped by and is being raised among the Comanche. It's a journey that tests the character of the two men as they search in hopes of finding Debbie.
All right, Jonathan. So let's present a thesis. Before we talk about the individual ideas of the searchers, let's present the thesis of the searchers, because I feel like we've kind of set up a pattern for the day where My Darling Clementine is at the scale, at the far end of being like a love letter to the Westerns, all the mythologies in place. The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance is going to be a complete deconstruction of the Western and the idea of mythologizing
taking
the Western.
Taking off the rosy glasses, basically.
Yeah, and the Searchers, I think, is somewhere in the middle. At first glance, it's very easy to watch it and see the romantic Western tropes, but underneath it, you also see a lot of stuff undercutting the idea of the Western hero as a whole. Because technically on screen, a lot of what Ethan does, Ethan being the protagonist character,
John Wayne,
who played by John Wayne, is fulfilling the roles of a Western hero. A lot of his thoughts, actions, and behaviors undercut that and kind of reveal him to be sort of a not good guy who by the end of the movie manages to basically do one good thing. And then if you're looking at it through that lens, you kind of left with the idea, the big question at the end of the movie, that kind of turns it into a thought piece is, does that redeem him? Was he a hero at any point along the journey?
Yeah.
So there's a lot of incredible technique that goes into this movie. But the most fascinating part for me is that idea that this super masculine, typical Western hero is maybe this really like hate-filled, racist, not so good, very violent, very cynical man, and maybe all of the impacts of living in the West have turned him into this guy. He's an ex-Civil War vet not on the good side of the war.
Yeah.
He fought on the French side in the Second French-Mexican War. He clearly doesn't just not like Native Americans. He hates Native Americans to an alarming extent, so much so that it's very clear that the reason his adoptive nephew is following him around at a certain point is to make sure that he doesn't kill his daughter or his niece when he finds her. So he pulls off one good action at the end of the movie. So it's interesting through that lens, but at the same time, there is this whole the arc, the hero's journey exists in terms of the typical heroic Western, which I think is what makes this so interesting to me.
Yeah, and I think it's less about the one heroic action, and it's more of the progressive mindset shift, which I want to get into in a second, because I really think that it's about, because the point I kind of want to start on is there's more or less two big camps of Westerns, and we're mostly focusing throughout this whole series on the martial versus outlaw type, but there's also the cowboys versus Indians type, and this is in that camp, but it's also a subversion of that type of film, and I think it looks like it falls into that for a lot of it, but I think the whole point of the film is the coming around, the seeing the Native Americans as actual human people by the end of it. And I really think that it is a progressive realization for Ethan throughout the film because, like you said, his nephew or honorary nephew, I wasn't exactly sure how he fits in there.
Adoptive nephew, it seems
adoptive
to be.
Nephew.
Yeah.
He's an eighth Native American. I think he was Cherokee.
It's ironic too, because it turns out that Ethan is the one who saved Martin as a kid from a Native American raid.
Was he the one that did that? See, I was a little confused on the timeline if the Ethan's brother-in-law had taken him in and saved him, or I wasn't sure exactly how all the backstory had happened.
Ethan saved him, but he left him with his brother.
Okay.
So
and then
Martin
they took
kind of
him in
becomes
as their
an adoptive member of Ethan's brother's family.
Yeah.
Yeah. Which is kind of set up on purpose because Martin saved the kid, but he also hates 1/8 of him.
Right. But the point is that at the beginning of the film and through basically the first half, Ethan makes it very clear that he does not want to be familially related to Martin at all. And he's not going to recognize him as kin. And he drives it home to the point where Martin almost gets depressed at one point, saying, "I've got no money, I've got no kin, I've got nothing. So what do you want from me?" And then as we see, Ethan is kind of through the journey. He's going through a journey in his own mind, and he knows that the girl is being I don't know what's the right
she's being
word.
Raised by her captors.
Yeah, I was more or less assimilated. I don't know if that's the right word, but you get the idea. Assimilated into the Native American culture, and the more that he thinks about that, the more he realizes she's going to be more, in practice, more Native American than Martin is, and so he writes her off, but then at some point he starts to take in Martin as they spend more time together. And then he writes his will out to Martin, and Martin rejects it. But it's a big step for Ethan's character, I think, just to even consider.
It is a big step for Ethan's character.
Martin that's kind of his half step, right? Because he's thinking, oh, he's 1/8 Cherokee. I could probably live with that. And then by the end of the film, he comes to a more complete acceptance. And of course, the film takes the route of keeping that kind of a secret from us until the very end. So it does feel like a last minute kind of thing. Yeah. But I think that it reveals this transition that's happening throughout the rest of the film as we go through the story. And I think that's really interesting because it is kind of this almost, not even apology. It's almost more of a call to action of other types of Western films. Like, we need to embrace more of this acceptance mentality than this adversarial type of mentality.
Yeah. That is a bit of a theme that I've seen written about in John Ford's work. I haven't watched a lot of his stuff in a certain order, so it's hard for me to speak on specific examples, but I have heard, obviously we talked about the Iron Horse and how even though that isn't disparaging of Native Americans, how they're kind of just treated as scenery, and that film, there is often this discourse around John Ford movies not being the best depictions of Native Americans. But if you watch a lot of his later movies,
it's a conflicted depiction.
It's essentially like the writings I saw talk about how John Ford's depiction evolves over time, and how it starts to be a more humanistic approach. I think one of the most powerful examples in this movie is when you finally meet Scar, who is the battle chief, war chief that they're following this whole time.
He's the one who kills Mufasa. Sorry, I had to. Anyway, when we meet him, we finally find out his backstory and why he acts the way he does. And he's like, I've taken a scalp and captives for each one of my sons who's been killed by the white man. And you're like, oh, there's a horrible cycle of violence going on here. On both sides, right. Because we've seen the Native American violence firsthand, but then we get, okay, there was violence on both. Like, again, you said cycle is the perfect word because it just goes back and forth.
Once there's that level of just hate, like, I mean, the kind of hate that causes that one dude who gets killed really early in the movie, I don't remember his name, but the blonde kid. But the kind of hate that causes him to like smash the corpse of a dead Native American with a rock. that kind of hate.
Yeah.
Which, it feels really hateful, but also his fiance and her entire family was just murdered. So you see how all of these personal things become, all these personal hatreds from personal actions become broader actions, can become racism as a whole, which is a rather nuanced message for a genre that most people accused of having no nuance at all.
Right.
Which is oftentimes the criticism you see of this movie is that it's racist. And I'm like, the whole point of this movie is that racism is bad.
Yeah. And yeah, it's interesting too, because that type of, the depiction in this film of, a nuanced take on racism. And then there's some of those nuances and even the depiction or nuances / contradictions in the depiction of masculinity and stuff like that. But I think the interesting thing is that even if the film presents nuance, it can still be taken and mythologized and distilled to just the stuff that looks cool, but is also the stuff that the less cool parts of the film are saying, these are not the things that you should be to be a man, or the way that you should interact with people who aren't like you. But then those parts get discarded in the cultural imagination, and now suddenly Westerns are John Wayne shooting Indians in the eyes so that they can't go to their spirit world.
Yeah, there is always a danger to creating with subtext, even though subtext is such a good when
you pick up on it, it's more powerful.
Yeah, but when it's so easy for people to just gloss over it, right?
Yeah.
To embrace the idea of Ethan's masculinity, even though the whole point of the movie is that his form of masculinity is bad.
Yeah.
Another interesting theme around Ethan that I find is really interesting is that he's, even though he's depicted super masculine, he's kind of a coward in an interesting way. He's a bit of a lost causer, right? So he's fought on the losing side of multiple wars, normally for bad ideals too. But also when things get tough, he has a tendency to run away unless he's got this real vendetta or real righteous cause to rally around. He just kind of leaves. I mean, even at the end of the movie, he just leaves.
Yeah, I guess so. Although it's interesting because kind of, a lot of the film is that relentlessness.
Yeah, when he has a cause.
Yeah.
When he has this cause, he can get around, then he can do it. But he doesn't seem to know how to function as a person. He doesn't seem comfortable unless he has that righteous cause to follow.
I guess when you put it that way, well, yeah, it's funny that you say righteous cause, because when you put it that way, it's that he has a cause, although, like you said, he's usually on the wrong side and the ideals are less than righteous. But
my intent isn't that it's objectively righteous, but in his mind,
right,
it's a certain self-righteous cause, I should say.
But it's interesting that he's even on the losing side of his own vendetta, because by the time he gets there, he was fully intending to murder her. And by the time he gets there, he's come around to the other side, and he is undermining his original intent. So I think that's kind of interesting too. He's always on the losing side, even if it's against himself.
I don't think he even gets to kill Scar, right? It's Martin who kills Scar.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Out of self-defense too at the end.
Yeah. But I guess we should also talk about the fact that beyond that main overarching theme, there's a lot of other elements to this film. There's a lot of comic relief. Yeah, there's a lot of comic relief. There's the love story that becomes a humorous story. There's elements of this that get pulled into another great John Ford film that my parents love, which is The Quiet Man, another John Wayne film.
Ooh, I love The Quiet Man. Yeah.
But that story of Martin and Laurie, where by the end he comes in, she's been waiting for him for years and has finally decided to marry the nerdy postman.
Johnny Guitar or whatever.
Yeah. And then he comes in to bust up the wedding, and they have to brawl over her, but then they kind of end up being, pals by the end of it. That's the whole point of The Quiet Man. So there's a lot of these other elements that are mixed in with this really deep theme of antagonism and racism and stuff like that.
Oh, yeah. And I mean, there's obviously lots of there's both good examples of masculinity and toxic examples of masculinity abound in this movie. Mm-hmm. It really does have an epic scale of proportions when you think about the time covered, the years-long search, and like when they're really ranging across the West and they go up north in the bitter cold and they go down south to Mexico, and the whole wide range of exploring the West really reminds me of the sections of Django Unchained.
Yeah, I didn't think about it till you said that, but that's spot on.
Yeah, and that's, again, just to say that obviously Quentin Tarantino is a huge John Ford fan. That is very clear. But that is to say that John Ford influenced a lot of people. So we're going to be mentioning that a lot. Or it's stuff like the doorway shot, the famous doorway shot that both opens and closes the movie. One where John Ford arrives and one where John Ford leaves, which
John
is
Wayne.
a beautiful... John Wayne. Gosh darn it. Why has everyone got John names? But yeah, I mean, that doorway shot has been used so many times in so many places. And this is really the movie that made it famous. I believe there's a version of it in Star Wars.
Speaking of Star Wars, the literal burning of the homestead is straight up copied in A New Hope.
Yeah. It's a good, and we talked about how like, the overtext of this movie, I don't know what you call that, the foretext, the ubertext, as a opposite of subtext. What do you call that?
Motif.
Just text, the motif. But the main thread of this movie does follow the hero's journey. And so that burning of the homestead, the point of no return, so to speak, where nothing can go back to normal, does exist. It is in this movie in a big way, and you can see it copied or used, I should say, in other movies down the line, like Star Wars.
Yeah, for sure. And it's funny. Oh gosh, everything is connected because we talked about we did a whole episode comparing Hidden Fortress to Star Wars, and as we just talked about, Hidden Fortress directed by Akira Kurosawa, influenced by John Ford. So it's just. Yeah. Everything you love came from stuff way, way before.
Yeah, it's all connected. It's all connected. Artists just use the best. Everyone's always working to develop new, cool ways to do things in the art world. And whenever something it works and is cool and other people like it, they use it. And that's kind of the fun thing about film and art in general, and the fun part about studying film history in general. And honestly, if we wanted to do frame by frame, you could probably find a 5 bajillion shots in this movie and sequences that are copied later on. I mean, even down to like, and speaking again about where it pulls from Western mythology and then uses it to subvert it, you even have like the Western posse, so to speak, is like the form of the medieval party, right? The party of heroes or the fantasy version
Knights
of heroes.
of the Round Table or whatever.
Yeah. You have the party split even, like the factoring of the fellowship, so to speak. Except there's no treants involved. And then go off on their separate ways to pursue different adventures and all sorts of stuff. The rhymes to it are endless. This is an interesting movie because it uses all of the mythologizing tools we saw in My Darling Clementine and the Westerns of the silent era, but puts them in a new light and starts kind of like essentially the deconstruction or subversion of Western themes as well. As opposed to being a love letter, which is one of the reasons it's so famous. And often, I mean, The Searchers is normally up on the top 10 list, if not just number 1 of most watched Westerns. I think it's like number 3 on the AFI list or something like that of best movies of all time, just in general too. But yeah, it's one worth watching, and it's one worth watching with a keen mind to both pick apart what's there in the text and subtext.
Yeah. Yeah, and this, like you said, starts the deconstruction of the Western and the inward turning, the looking in the mirror of the mythology, which is kind of continued and, for Ford at least, culminized, I think, in The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance. So, shall we?
Jason, take it away.
The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance from 1962. U.S. Senator Ransom Stoddard and his wife Haley revisit the western town of Shinbone and recall their past there, regarding how they met back when Ransom was a penniless lawyer, their friend Tondanepron, and the violent outlaw Liberty Valance.
So, I think the original title for this film was actually Mr. Smith Goes West.
It's very similar to that, isn't it? Yeah. It is.
That's how I felt the whole time.
I mean, yeah, it's Jimmy Stewart doing his politician thing again, right?
It's so perfect for what the themes are. The pairing of Jimmy Stewart and John Wayne is just completely unbeatable.
It's really, really cool. I mean, they're set up as kind of foils to each other in a certain way, and as a triple foil to Liberty Valance as well,
right?
As a character, but John Wayne and Jimmy Stewart specifically. Jimmy Stewart is like the righteous man who kind of symbolizes the closing of the West because he's coming in to bring order to a place that is chaos.
Yeah, he
and
represents
John Wayne,
law, written down knowledge, understanding, and widespread knowledge as a teacher and all of that, rather than just individual pockets of knowledge.
And John Wayne is the rugged individual, the Old West cowboy. He's quick with his gun. He's quick with his fists. He can drink hard. He's got a homestead. All the old cliches of what a Western hero is. And again, this is one of those setups of the inversion of heroicism and masculinity, where John Wayne is clearly the much more masculine of the two characters in terms of like those themes. But Jimmy Stewart is set up to be the hero through most of the piece.
Yeah.
And again, John Wayne kind of gets one heroic moment of sorts. I don't know. It's interesting if you'd call that a heroic moment, but
I mean, yeah, it's all complicated. Everything about this movie has a front and an underside to it.
Yeah, it is. And that's kind of the point, right?
Mm-hmm. And I love the setup as the, old Jimmy Stewart comes in with his wife, and, everyone reveres them as like these people who have the history in this town, and
back to Shinbone,
which is just great. And then you get these hints of what had come before we dive into the backstory. It's a great, just general storytelling technique. But it's so perfect for this kind of film with these kinds of themes.
Oh yeah. It's got a very good and I think it's important too because it sets up essentially a nostalgia for what was before, or the Old West that was, which is kind of, again, deconstructing the idea of the Western as a form of nostalgia in and of itself, even when it isn't told through this flashback style. Yeah. Right.
I mean, really, it's almost at the beginning, you could almost see it as John Ford coming in. He's towards the end of his career, and he comes in, and he's a mythologized character, and people are coming to him like, what was it like? What was it like? And he's saying, this is how it used to be. This is how Hollywood was. This is how the West was. And it's not what you think. This is John Ford taking a look at what he had created as a mythology and looking at it with clearer eyes, I think.
Oh, very much so. Very much so. I mean, the central idea of the film is summed up pretty well within the film itself. And I think what could probably just be the subheader for this entire series on Westerns, when the legend becomes fact, print the legend, which is honestly quite poignant nutshelling of the whole idea of the Western.
I haven't seen this film in a few years, but that line is just tied to this movie. I didn't remember all the details of the story, but that's just so poignant, especially when we're talking about how, the Western films created a mythology that wasn't true. And now Western films are looking back and saying, not all of these mythologies are how it actually happened, but which one are you going to print and spread and believe in?
Exactly. And it basically goes back to the idea of even pre-film Western media, the Dimeback novels and the Wild West shows, which were like, what are we going to sell? What are we going to print? Well, the legend,
it's Buffalo
the coolest
Bill
version of the events.
It's Buffalo Bill. It's Wyatt Earp. And that's okay. I guess I'm going to kind of throw this out just to get us into the meat of the story. But the sheriff character in this film, and it's probably a little too disparaging, but it's made me think of when I was reading about how Wyatt Earp was not the forefront of the OK Corral. And of course, in this film, it's, Jimmy Stewart gets held up as the man who shot Liberty Valance, although he didn't really perpetrate that as like his own image of himself. But the sheriff in the film is always saying he's the most cowardly character in the whole film. And every time John Wayne throws someone out of a bar, he says, "Now you tell them that Sheriff so-and-so kicked you out and said never come back." Like trying to make his own name great in the history of the town. And it almost feels like, Wyatt Earp writing his own autobiography and Buffalo Bill creating his own, show to show off, what it was like back then. It's like, "Now you tell them this is what I did." That was your brother Virgil, wasn't it? "Well, you tell them what I did."
Yeah. I mean, in a large part, yeah. I mean, a huge part of the story is about not just the way that these stories are spread, but how important the idea of one's reputation is. And I'd like to say that we've gotten away from it, but no, it's pretty important still to this day. And the idea of like what is your personal history? How do you present yourself? I mean, if you think about like Liberty Valance, one of the ways he wields power is not just by beating people up, but by the threat that the stories told about him that like, "Oh, you don't mess with Liberty Valance."
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure and we talk about this with like monster movies and stuff, like the biggest way to show how scary a monster is to show how scared people are of the monster. The reaction shot effect, essentially. Yeah. And so you see that with Liberty Valance. You probably hear more people talk about how scary Liberty Valance is more often than you do see him.
Although they do a good job of they establish his character right off the bat by beating the crap out of Jimmy Stewart with a silver handled whip. So we get that he has actual teeth. Like the shark has teeth, but we don't have to see the shark eating people
violent stuff
every 20 minutes.
Yeah. He's a very good monster for this movie.
Yeah. Every time he's on screen, something really bad goes down.
Honestly, the part of the movie where they beat up the newspaper man is, I
hate that scene so much.
One of the most like viscerally violent and upsetting scenes I've seen on film.
I think part of it is that the newspaper man is almost comic relief for half the film, and he gets such a brutal death that it's almost.
Well, he's not killed.
He almost doesn't make it.
Yeah, he's fine. He's injured for life.
Yeah,
he has that cane, but he does make it. But yeah, he's the comic relief. He's one of our favorite characters. He's not so to go into the chivalric theme to the West, right? Like who's a valid target and who's not. Would not be considered a valid target. It would be dishonorable to attack him.
Yeah, and
so that's what we're seeing. We're seeing Liberty Valance do something completely disreputable, not just because it's extremely violent, but because this is not the guy who you should be beating up. Your fight is with Jimmy Stewart, but you're doing this just to piss off Jimmy Stewart.
Right.
And on top of it, the news reporter is completely drunk and helpless the entire time.
Yeah.
Like just he can't.
And he's at his worst in that scene.
Yeah. He's not just beat up, he's humiliated. And it's his livelihood is destroyed in the way they trash his place. Like it is a brutal, violent scene, but plays well into the themes of the movie and the deconstruction again of the chivalry supposedly at play in the Wild West.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean we do have the two different versions of chivalry in the foils of Jimmy Stewart and John Wayne, because you still have John Wayne's cowboy masculinity, but he's always very respectful to our female character Hallie, and you could tell from the beginning that he likes her a lot. And then Jimmy Stewart comes in you know, he likes her, but she's not like the first thing on his mind. He's trying to fry bigger fish. He's trying to get law in this town. He does the Wyatt Earp thing where he comes in and basically says, what kind of a town is this? Except he doesn't have a gun.
What kind of town is this?
Yeah, that's the theme of this episode. What kind of a town is this? And then he kind of subtly wins her over almost against his own, or without even intending to initially. So you have that kind of contrast there, but it's also the shift of affection in, you know, a broader sense from the rugged West to the civilized, progressive future, right? So again, it's the old West, the rugged individualism, the street justice, all of that is being left behind in favor of the black and white written down law, and the progressivism represented by Jimmy Stewart's character. And Hallie kind of represents society's shift in affection in that sense. And yet, even by the end, you see that even though Hallie wanted to move towards the Jimmy Stewart type of future, she still has this deep love and nostalgia for the John Wayne type of past. And that's kind of the conflict of the whole film.
Yeah, that's why Western films made banger box offices. That nostalgia for the West. Yeah. And I mean, even then, I guess there is some element too, although this might be a bit of a reach, where we have to consider how reliable the narration is in this film, right? Because we assume it's basically all being narrated by Stewart, but we also have to assume, and it's being told to us as this is the real truth, as opposed to what you know. But we don't really know whether what he's telling us is the truth as well. Although I guess that might be adding another layer of complexity to this, and I don't see.
I think we're supposed to take it as truth.
I think that might be a step too far in this instance.
I think there's a time and place for that, but this film is, you know, that's the layer that we're really supposed to camp out on.
Oh yeah, I will say too that this film probably has the least like landscape photography out of the.
It's almost a bottle in terms of.
Yeah, it's very much
scope.
Inside the town.
Yeah,
but it is shot.
It's almost
in
just
black.
In that diner.
Yeah. It takes place largely at night. It's almost a stage play in a lot of ways, but it was shot in black and white intentionally, even though this is the 60s and you could very easily shoot in color. That was the main form of film at the time. But it was done in black and white to accentuate Ford's use of shadows, which makes sense because it is a movie about truth and darkness and lies and the truth behind the legend and kind of revealing that. And after all, at the very end, you do see the climactic scene is Jimmy Stewart doing something in the light and John Wayne doing something in the shadows.
Yeah. Not to mention when you're hearkening back to the old Westerns, how can you not do a film like this in black and white? Especially as someone who's made Stagecoach and My Darling Clementine and these classic Westerns that people have in mind when they think of Westerns that are in black and white.
I think that is very much part of the intent too, right? Like to evoke that nostalgia as well. To not, because color would still feel new at the time. So black and white would evoke that feeling of old. Now, what would be really crazy is if he did the modern day scenes in color and the flashback in black and white.
Whoa,
that would be crazy.
Whoa.
Too wild?
Too wild.
Too wild.
That actually feels like a very modern kind of trick. So
that is a very modern idea.
He could have pulled it off. If it was Tarantino, he'd have done the modern scenes in 70 millimeter color and the old scenes in 4:3 black and white.
Yeah. Anything else to say about?
Yeah, I mean, I think the kind of thing to take away from the film is when we're talking about the way that Ford is able to produce a nuance, whether that's in terms of certain types of masculinity, whether that's in terms of certain attitudes of race or group identity. I think this one is that nuance in terms of a nostalgia. Because we have both elements of the good and the bad of the past and the good and the bad of the present, and the ways that
what about
we
the
see
ugly?
them. And the ugly, that's Liberty Valance. But yeah, there's so many different layers to the whole thing. There's the way that it's perceived. There's the way that it happened. There's the way that it's remembered. There's all of these things that just paint this really, really interesting tapestry. And I think that a film like this could not have been made the same by anyone other than someone who had been so influential in the creating of the mythology of the West. Anything else would have been more homage to the West and not that clear-sighted reflection that this film actually is.
Yeah, no, that's fair. I mean, it is very interesting too to see somebody's career basically be built around, or in large part, be building a genre, and then on the reverse side, deconstructing it and breaking it down in that way. It is something rather unique in the history of film. So it makes it a very unique part of John Ford's story.
You either die a hero. All right, moving on to overall notes.
Yes. All right. Well, we should talk about some of the technical expertise of John Ford. I mean, we mentioned earlier how he basically came up in the industry working on his brother's production company, fulfilling almost every role on set: actor, stuntman, cameraman, script editor, all sorts of stuff. And it made him a super efficient filmmaker. He was famous for basically following the script to the letter. I remember reading some interviews with him where he was like, if I had a scene I didn't like, I wouldn't cut it. I would just get through it as fast as possible and minimize it as much as possible.
Yeah. The one thing that he would do that I came across in several interviews, because I was picking through the AFI conversations finding...
Is it the hand thing?
No, it's in terms of what you're talking about. If he had a scene that he didn't like or that he didn't think was going to play off right, he would hold wide. And he would play the entire scene in a wide and never cut in. And there are several other directors who said that I learned to hold on the wide from John Ford, because other directors just have to cut into the close-ups. They have to see the star or whatever. But if John Ford didn't like the scene, he just pulled back and let it play and moved on.
Yeah. De-emphasize what's not meant to be emphasized.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a really basic directorial technique, but it's a really important one. It's a fundamental one. What to emphasize and what not to emphasize. And one that when I was working in dailies and TV, I wish more TV directors would do. But I guess they were held to the studio, so I can't really blame them too much. But man, oh man, the number of unnecessary close-ups I've seen in my day. Sometimes you don't need the close-up. Save it for when it's important. But another thing he was famous for was exacting a lot of control over his movies, even in post, which traditionally up through the 60s, probably up until the point of the American New Wave, was pretty much done at the studio's behest and under the studio's control, more so than the directors. And so he would do stuff like if he knew that there was going to be a part of a shot that he didn't want in the final edit, he would just step up and put his hand in front of the camera for that. And then when he wanted the shot, part of the shot was coming up where he wanted it in the final edit, he would take his hand away. That way they had no choice but to cut around his hand.
Yeah.
To include only the parts he wanted in the final edit, which is quite impressive. And of course, speaking of the camera, he is one heck of a cinematographer. I don't know if I can think of someone else besides maybe one of his disciples like Kurosawa, who was quite as skilled as at evoking landscape into basically becoming a character as part of the scene in his cinematography in the way John Ford did.
There was another anecdote about the cinematographers who would reframe Ford's shots. I think the same guy, Clothier, was saying that when he was an operator, Ford would be working on the camera or whatever, and then the DP would say, all right, scoot the camera over this way. And then he would take over the camera and Ford would come back and say, did you move this camera? This isn't where I put it. And so then he's, after 3 or 4 times, told the DP, you tell him that you moved it. And then he was saying that another cinematographer shot something that he tried to tell John Ford, this is not like, you could do this better. This isn't a good shot, blah, blah, blah. And he shot it anyway, the way that John Ford wanted to, and won an award for it. So you don't second guess John Ford, or at least you get his advice on whatever you're trying to change.
Yeah, I mean, if somebody's coming at you with that much experience and is an acknowledged master,
and
he would say to the guy.
He would say, shoot it the way I told you, and if it doesn't turn out good, I'll be the first person to cut it in the editing room.
Yeah.
So, he knew what he wanted.
Oh yeah.
He was very much Hitchcockian in that sense. And I think it's interesting too. You mentioned that he would, do things like that to get his way, have his control on the film during a very studio controlled era. And one of the ways it was phrased in an anecdote that I saw is that there was a group of those directors who would do that. And I think that's interesting because we talk about the auteurs a lot, but the auteurs are not necessarily an arbitrary group of filmmakers that the French filmmakers really liked, but they're a group of filmmakers who battled the studio to get their own way. And they're auteurs because they fought for their specific vision of each film that they did, which includes Hitchcock, which includes Ford, which includes, Lang and some of the other...
Howard Hawks,
especially. And the ways that they would fight for their specific vision. And John Ford is one of the biggest, again, personalities in that group of filmmakers. There was a great quote between Hawks where he said that when towards the end of John Ford's life, he would go out and visit him in his little desert home, and he would just walk in, and Ford would start laughing, and Hawks would say, "What are you laughing about?" He said, "I just remembered something I stole from you that was hilarious." And then they would go back and forth. Well, I stole this from you. Well, I stole this from you, because there were certain things that Hawks did certain kinds of comedy better than Ford did, and so Ford would steal that from him, and Ford did certain things better than Hawks did, and he would steal that. But there was this great camaraderie between a lot of those guys.
Yeah, that's how good creativity works. It's collaborative in that sense, where you find the best stuff and you put it together. Yeah, it's really, really, really cool. But yeah, and we've talked about this, already. But John Ford had this recurring cast of characters who would use in a lot of films, his stock company, so to speak. That's the terminology I was trying to remember earlier.
Oh, there you go.
Although he would often give his actors very little direction, and was even on more than one occasion verbally abusive to them when they would go off script, or sometimes just because to kind of assert his control over set, which probably isn't the best working thing. It definitely wouldn't be tolerated in a modern day setting. But considering that so many actors stuck around, you can assume that there was some kind of camaraderie that developed there, even though it was a turbulent relationship. I mean, for instance, John Ford managed to make John Wayne cry on set.
Yeah.
But also John Wayne was like devoted to John Ford. He basically referred to him as his father for most of his life, and he would call him like Paps or something like that.
Yeah, there was another quote about, John Ford would for the most time, he would take actors aside and give them direction and stuff. But he said, if you saw him talk to John Wayne, you'd swear he hated the guy. Just the way that they interacted.
Yeah. Which is funny because John Ford had such an interesting take on trying to basically examine and deconstruct ideas of masculinity and heroism in his film, which we've talked about through all of these films. But those themes are present in a lot of his work, and yet he still displayed some traits of toxic masculinity. But that's a level of personal psychology that we're not qualified to dive into on this show. But yeah, I mean, it's interesting that he also both created and deconstructed the Western genre, and quite prodigiously too. I mean, he made so many movies. It's kind of a shame that not so many of his silents still exist today, but still 10 Silence is pretty good. And to see those compared to his later Westerns is quite the evidence of development over the course of a career.
Yeah, absolutely.
But yeah, if you're interested in learning more about John Ford, obviously he's got lots of films. They're everywhere and very easily accessible. They're probably playing on the TV at your local gym or cafe or whatever. Do recommend. But also, there's lots of writing about him. Peter Bogdanovich did a whole book devoted to just John Ford called John Ford, which was published in 1971 and consists of his interviews with the man, if you want to hear about his work in his own words. And, of course, you probably don't even need to...
There's also, real quick, there's a documentary on John Ford called Directed by John Ford, with John Ford and Peter Bogdanovich doing interviews and stuff like that.
Yeah, there you go. There you go. But also, even if you just watch movies and you don't specifically seek out John Ford or read about him, you're probably going to be seeing influences from him in the work that you watch. He influenced so many people who are big names: Orson Welles, Ingmar Bergman, the French New Wave directors, the American film brats. Yeah, and those people in turn influenced more people because, again, it's all connected. Like we're trying to drive into you. Is that point clear yet? Have you guys seen that's all connected? I wonder if we've said that enough. Okay, good, we got it. But of course, maybe most notably, especially for the future of Westerns, because his work would come back around and influence them again in its own way. John Ford was a huge influence on Akira Kurosawa. And by connection, other Japanese Chanbara directors, Chanbara being the word for Japanese historical sword fighting movies. And even a quote from Kurosawa: "I've respected John Ford from the beginning. Needless to say, I pay close attention to his productions, and I think I'm influenced by them." There's also this really, really good photo
Akira
of
Kurosawa
them meeting.
saying, "I think I'm influenced by them," is the most Akira Kurosawa way of saying, "I love John Ford."
Yeah, it's a very, like... it's a very roundabout way of saying you love somebody, but it tracks for Kurosawa.
His whole autobiography is like that, just so subdued.
Yeah, it's you'll see a lot online. I've seen a million BuzzFeed style articles where it's like, "Did you know Westerns were influenced by these Japanese films?" Blah, 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 which is true, but also Kurosawa was influenced by John Ford, and we're going to be following that thread in chronological order from John Ford to Kurosawa and other Japanese Chanbara directors. And specifically, what movies are we talking about, Jonathan?
First, so we're skipping over Yojimbo because we've already covered Yojimbo, but it's going to
covered Yojimbo.
We're going to talk about Yojimbo a lot in this next episode and the following. But we're starting off with Samurai 1, Musashi Miyamoto from 1954. Following that with the sequel to Yojimbo, which is Sanjuro, from 1962, and finally The Sword of Doom from 1966.
Yeah, it's I'm really excited for this week. I've seen all these movies before. I highly recommend them. If you haven't seen Yojimbo, go watch that as well. If you haven't seen the entire Samurai trilogy, I would recommend it as well. The final duel of the final movie is incredible. But yeah, I highly recommend it. Go check those out, and I'm excited to talk about those next time on the podcast with you, Jonathan.
Yeah, absolutely. Samurai films are always a blast.
Well, that's about all the time we have for this episode.
To find links to things that we talked about today, as well as a complete list of past episodes and all 456 films we've covered so far, visit thefilmlings.com.
You can also join us for ongoing film discussions on our Discord server.
And to stay posted about upcoming episodes, follow us on Twitter @thefilmlings.
Summaries for this episode were recorded by me, Blue Jay. You can find me on Twitter @thebluejay1994.
If you like the show, let us know. Leave us a review on iTunes so other people will know what we're all about.
We definitely appreciate it.
Talk to you next time.
All right, see ya.
I can't wait until they're doing the flashbacks in 16:9 and the modern day scenes in
VR.
What would like a vertical ratio be? Like
literally
9:16. Well, I guess yeah. 9:16. Yeah.
M. Night Shyamalan's new film, The TikTokening.
Oh gosh.
Oh gosh, how did we get here on the John Ford episode?
So yeah, sorry, John Ford would probably hate TikTok. I mean, he hates a lot of things.
Absolutely.
He would hate TikTok. He'd be like, "Why the heck is this vertical?"
Yeah.
I mean, just it does make sense.
Cue the shots of John Wayne trashing his house. That's John Ford on TikTok.